A wedding night is meant to be the start of a life together, right? A moment of intimacy, love, and celebration. But what if, instead of romance, you were greeted by witnesses, slaves, and a silent physician? What if the centerpiece of your wedding chamber wasn't a bed, but a shrouded wooden idol, 4 feet tall? Imagine 18-year-old Livia Tursa, dressed in her saffron-colored wedding veil, stepping across the threshold, convinced she is following a sacred, joyful tradition. She was never told about the clinical examination. She was never told her body would be officially documented. And she was certainly never prepared for the object concealed beneath that heavy linen cloth. An object everyone in the room, except the bride, understood perfectly. In a few minutes, you'll grasp the terrifying purpose of the doctor waiting patiently in the corner. You'll know why Livia's own mother wept while arranging her hair earlier that day. And you will realize that this Roman wedding was not about forging a loving union, but about verifying an asset. This isn't historical fiction. This was the dark reality of marriage in ancient Rome. A ceremony so deeply disturbing that Roman historians deliberately avoided describing it, and early Christian writers later attempted to erase its memory from existence. By the time that veil is lifted, Livia will uncover the raw truth hidden beneath the pomp. Rome wanted the world to forget this secret. We won't. If the hidden, unsettling truths of the past are what truly fascinate you, then make sure to subscribe to our channel right now. Once you reach the moment that shocks you the most in this story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Let's dive in. The year is 89 CE. The Emperor Domitian ruled the empire with absolute authority, and Livia Tursa, at 18, was about to experience the two irreconcilable faces of the Roman wedding. There was the public face, the cheerful songs, the saffron flammeum veil, the scattering of walnuts, the grand procession. And then there was the hidden face, performed in a locked room before a select group of strangers who were prepared to repeat every minute detail before a court magistrate if ever required. The horror Livia was about to undergo was a ritual so intensely uncomfortable that ancient Roman authors consistently omitted direct descriptions. Later Christian polemicists attempted to destroy all records of it. Before this terrifying encounter with the physician and the covered statue, Livia's day had been deceptively beautiful. Her wedding procession had unfolded like a dream sequence. She wore the flame-colored flammeum that proclaimed her status as a bride. Her hair had been meticulously styled at sunrise, parted using a traditional spearhead and woven into 6 precise braids secured with strips of wool. Every single detail followed a precise, inherited custom. At the temple, the sacrifice had been successful. The priest declared favorable omens after reading the sheep's glistening entrails. Her father performed the ancient legal transfer, moving her from his control, patria potestas, to her husband's, reciting the rigid formula. Livia herself had spoken the words that generations of brides had whispered, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are head, I am mistress. A vow confirming that she no longer held autonomy over herself. Her new husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, was a wealthy grain merchant, 25 years her senior, whom she had only met on 3 prior occasions. By Roman law, the public ceremony had already initiated her transfer. But it was only the start of a complex process. In Rome, the binding moment did not happen under the open sky. It waited for them at the end of the torchlit march through the city, inside a house Livia had never set foot in, surrounded by individuals she had not consented to meet. The crowds who lined the streets had sung the traditional Fescennine verses, deliberately crude, sexually explicit, and calculated to amuse the gods and ward off bad luck. Young men yelled embarrassing suggestions through Livia's thick veil, making her face flush with shame. Her mother had tried to reassure her, saying the songs were harmless, a protection. But Livia had seen the way her mother's hands shook while arranging her hair that morning. She had witnessed the quickly hidden tears, and she remembered the last, chilling instruction whispered into her ear. Do not resist. Whatever they require of you, do not resist. It only lengthens the suffering. By the time they reached the residence of Marcus Petronius Rufus, the light of day had fully vanished. The doorway was adorned with wreaths of greenery and woven wool, 2 massive torches signaling a place where a marriage would be consummated according to ancestral law. The noise from the crowd outside intensified. Someone tossed walnuts, a fertility symbol, at her. The hard shells snagged the folds of her rich dress and painfully scraped her skin. It felt less like a blessing and more like a mockery. Marcus waited in the shadowed doorway. Behind him, Livia could distinguish too many shapes. Far more people than she had been told to expect. Tradition dictated that the groom must carry the bride over the threshold to prevent the dire omen of stumbling. But the gesture was actually far older than mere superstition. It was an echo of a brutal time when brides were not willingly entering their husbands' homes at all. Once the heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the noise outside, Livia finally saw the group waiting in the atrium. An elderly woman in official ceremonial robes, the pranuba, whose duty was to supervise the entire night. A priest whose affiliation was unclear. 3 female slaves carrying cloths and basins. An older man with a leather pouch likely containing medical tools. And in the farthest corner, shrouded by draped linen, a wooden framework that stood almost 4 feet high. The pranuba stepped forward and took Livia's hands, her grip surprisingly strong, enough to prevent any attempt to flee. "Welcome to your husband's house," she declared. "The sacred rites must now be brought to completion." Few individuals speak honestly about the true nature of Roman marriage. It was not a romantic ceremony. It was not sentimental. It was absolutely not a celebration of 2 souls uniting. It was, rather, a transaction. A legal transfer of authority, witnessed and sealed as rigorously as the sale of a livestock or a tract of farmland. Under the earliest Roman statutes, a wife moved completely into her husband's control, placed in manu, literally in his hand. He held the same legal power over her as he held over his personal slaves, including the theoretical right to decide her fate. By the era Livia was marrying, the laws had superficially softened. Women could legally own property. Divorce was possible. Certain aspects of paternal power had evolved. But the fundamental premise remained unshakable. Marriage was a legal shift of a woman from the control of one man to another. And like every significant transfer in Rome, this required absolute confirmation. Think about how Rome handled the sale of land. Witnesses observed the transfer. Religious rituals were performed. Boundaries were meticulously inspected and walked. Documents were drawn up and sealed. Nothing was left to chance. Everything had to be verified. The Romans applied this identical cold logic to their marriages, but with one grim, inescapable difference. The property being legally transferred was a human body, and that body's capacity to produce legitimate heirs was the asset being acquired. Therefore, Roman law absolutely demanded the bride's virginity and that the consummation of the marriage be certified before the union could be considered finalized. Not assumed, not rumored, but verified. The rituals designed to accomplish this verification, the ones Livia was moments away from facing, were those that almost no ancient writer dared to detail directly. Even in their brutal society, they were considered unspeakably intimate. Livia stood trembling next to the imposing, shrouded wooden figure, unaware that the next few minutes would be indelibly etched into her memory for the rest of her life. A rite so repulsive that subsequent generations would desperately attempt to claim it had never happened at all. Roman legal doctrine was brutally clear. A marriage was not legally or socially valid until the physical union was completed, and it was insufficient for the husband and wife to simply state that it had occurred. There is a requirement to be confirmation, testimony, and observation. Without witnesses, the entire marriage could be legally challenged. Without verification of the bride's integrity, the legitimacy of any future children could be thrown into question. For Rome, this uncertainty was intolerable. So the Romans invented these rituals. Rituals that fit perfectly within their legalistic, property-based worldview, and yet feel horrifyingly unimaginable to us today. The pranuba tightened her grip on Livia's arm and guided her toward the veiled structure in the corner. Livia's heart pounded so forcefully she felt the rhythm in her throat. She instinctively knew that whatever was hidden beneath that cloth would irrevocably change her life, her body, and her core beliefs. But there was no retreat now. "You must acknowledge mutinous tutness," The Pranuba murmured, her voice steady and emotionless, her fingers digging in. You must seek his blessing before your husband may approach you. The gods must witness your submission. Livia swallowed, her breathing uneven. She had never once heard this god's name, and she had no comprehension of what acknowledging him truly meant. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the draped fabric. The witnesses craned their necks forward. Even the slave holding the basin froze. The entire room seemed to be holding its collective breath. When Livia finally pulled the cloth away, the reason became horrifyingly clear. Beneath the covering stood a wooden statue, carved with anatomically shocking accuracy into the distinct shape of a phallic idol. This was not a small amulet worn for luck. It was not a crude scarecrow placed in a garden. It was deliberate, intentionally proportioned, and constructed for a single, unmistakable purpose. That purpose was instantly clarified the moment the Pranuba began to explain the ancient practice. Mutinous Tutinus was Rome's secretive deity of initiation and fertility. Classical authors mention him fleetingly and always with an air of profound embarrassment, as if the very name felt scandalous. Augustine, writing centuries later when Christianity had established dominance in Rome, described the ritual with white-hot fury and utter revulsion. Roman brides, he claimed, were required to sit upon the god's emblem before they lay with their new husbands, and they did this in the full view of the assembled witnesses. He condemned the practice, yet he did not invent the story. Other early Christian writers referenced the same rite, hinting it was too scandalous to describe publicly. Arnobius asserted brides were forced to straddle the symbol while their husbands watched. Lactantius argued that merely speaking of the act polluted the tongue. Even the pagan scholar Varro, centuries earlier, mentioned brides being presented to Mutinous Tutinus using language that implied physical contact, though he carefully omitted any explicit detail. Modern historians, feeling naturally uncomfortable with the implications, have frequently attempted to soften these descriptions, suggesting that perhaps the brides only sat lightly on the statue's lap in some vague, symbolic gesture. But the ancient terminology does not support this lighter interpretation. Augustine used the word incidere, which means to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius's phrasing suggested penetration. Lactantius simply refused to describe the details at all, something highly unlikely if the act had been a simple, symbolic tap. The official stated explanation was, of course, fertility. The deeply unspoken, terrifying purpose may have been entirely different: to destroy the bride's resistance, to physically demonstrate absolute submission before the witnesses, to prepare a terrified virgin bride for the legal requirement that followed. Livia stood paralyzed before the wooden god, the flickering lamplight casting its grotesque shadow across the wall. The Pranuba moved behind her, adjusting her posture, physically arranging her body, guiding her forward without any trace of gentleness. The witnesses observed in complete, chilling silence. Her husband observed. The physician waited behind them, his hands clasped, ready for the next grim part of the process. And in that frozen moment, Livia finally understood the true, terrifying meaning of her mother's trembling warning: do not resist. The coarse street songs, the absolute secrecy, the crushing dread. Livia now grasped the true, clinical demands of being a Roman wife. She was, theoretically, free to halt the proceedings. However, refusal meant the immediate collapse of the marriage contract. She would be returned to her father's household, not as a respected daughter, but as a publicly damaged, discarded woman, unmarriageable, toxic, and utterly untouchable. She would be a source of profound, whispered shame throughout her entire family. Her established life would simply cease to exist. So, the choice was an illusion. She did not refuse. As the obscene ritual with the idol concluded, slaves swiftly entered with basins of warmed, rose-scented water. They began washing her with unnerving care, reciting purification prayers intended to cleanse her after contact with the fertility god. But this cleansing had a far more disturbing practical utility. It prepared her for the next stage of her commodification, the examination. The physician, who had maintained his silent vigil, now stepped forward. Livia's stomach seized with a sickening realization. Part 2 was mandatory. In unions involving status, wealth, or political power, Roman law demanded medical documentation. Earlier in the day, a midwife or physician had already created a record confirming Livia's virginity. This initial affidavit established the baseline, the unaltered state of the asset, ready for legal transfer. These documents were later critical in settling disputes over inheritance, legitimacy, and paternity. The texts preserved by Roman medical authors, cruel in their objective precision, leave no doubt as to the invasive nature of the procedure. Now came the second post-ritual verification. This check confirmed that the encounter with mutinous Tutinus had occurred and that Livia was, by Roman legal definition, prepared for the final step. Everything transpired with the witnesses staring directly at her. Their later testimonies could be immediately demanded in court if the contract were ever questioned. And chillingly, not a single person in the room displayed the slightest flicker of human discomfort over what was being systematically done to her. Modern audiences recoil at these descriptions. What seems humiliating, deeply invasive, and traumatic to us was simply standard legal protocol to the Romans. The bride's emotional state was completely absent from the equation. Her feelings were as irrelevant to the process as the geological composition of a field being surveyed before a sale. Property does not possess feelings. Property is transferred, and the required procedures must be rigorously followed. If you find the ruthless objectivity of Roman law fascinating, or simply horrifying, make sure to subscribe to see more hidden histories like this one. When the medical examination was finally concluded, the Pronuba led Livia toward the marital chamber prepared for the definitive consummation. The room's arrangement was deliberately staged according to the oldest customs. The bed was positioned to ensure a clear view from the doorway, which, by strict tradition, was to remain open all night. Oil lamps burned brightly, casting enough illumination for the Pronuba to observe every moment without interruption. Slaves waited discreetly nearby to assist in the mourning. Every object, every shadow, felt calculated, arranged for a legal ceremony Livia could not escape. Marcus, the husband, finally entered. He paused at the threshold, giving the watching Pronuba an uneasy, almost seeking glance before stepping toward the bed. His expression betrayed something Livia hadn't expected. Not the confidence of a dominant man, but genuine discomfort. He seemed to understand that this act was not intimacy. It was an act of verification. And the night was far from over. That hesitation, a flicker of embarrassment across his face, surprised Livia more than any display of arrogance. She had anticipated a man assured, dominant, perfectly prepared for the night's demands. Instead, he sought Pronuba's gaze, as if for explicit permission. The matron lifted her head, her voice resonating with official authority. The bride is made ready. The gods have witnessed her compliance. Let the union be completed according to the ancestral rites. Let all present affirm the act. Let no doubt remain that this woman has officially become a wife. Her tone extinguished any possibility of postponement or refusal. What followed unfolded laboriously, hour after hour, under the persistent, unblinking observation of the appointed witnesses. The Pronuba maintained her vigil from the doorway, stepping forward only when tradition demanded a specific instruction, occasionally adjusting Livia's posture or correcting Marcus's approach, ensuring every part of the consummation strictly adhered to legal expectation. The door remained open, lamplight spilled into the corridor. Anyone in the household could hear the movements, the voices, the formal ritual commands. Every single sound became part of the documentation, part of the evidence. Nothing about this night was private. Nothing was meant to be. For Livia, the white bed sheets were effectively parchment, and her body the required ink Rome used to finalize its contract. Everything that transpired was a layer of verification, one final step to make the transfer of legal control unchallengeable. By dawn, the atmosphere was thick and stale, the oil lamps nearly extinguished. The physician returned. He stepped inside with the same detached, clinical demeanor he had exhibited earlier. His final task was simple: confirm that the act of consummation had successfully occurred and that Livia now bore the expected physical signs of a woman who had irrevocably passed from virgin to wife. His examination was recorded on a wax tablet. The Pranuba formally gave her sworn testimony. The witnesses confirmed their observations. The legal transformation was complete. Livia Tirsa, barely 18, was now officially a Roman matrona. Her identity, her role, and her entire future had been brutally finalized in a single, documented night. She would go on to bear children for the next decade. She would govern her husband's massive household, preside over formal dinners, manage the complex slave hierarchy, and perform her religious duties with the utmost composure. To the outside world, she would embody dignity, capability, and respectability. But regarding her wedding night, she would speak to no one, not even her own daughters. There were simply no common words for it. Livia's silence was not an isolated choice. It was universal. Women of her era did not chronicle these intimate experiences. Men did not document them in personal journals. The rituals were so profoundly woven into the framework of marital life that detailing them would have been as pointless as explaining breathing or daylight. Everyone knew, yet no one spoke. This is precisely why historians today struggle to reconstruct what genuinely transpired behind the closed doors of ancient Roman homes. Much of our knowledge comes from scattered fragments. Angry sermons from Christian reformers, shreds of legal commentary, brief mentions in medical treatises, and archaeological clues whose meaning is only realized when paired with these rare texts. The total absence of intimate, detailed accounts is not evidence of a mass conspiracy. It is evidence of complete familiarity. The rituals were the very water Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that to describe them felt redundant. For nearly 1,000 years, this was the legal reality of Roman marriage. Generations of young women endured the same scrutiny, the same witnesses, and the same night of formalized control. The system persisted because every layer of society, priests, families, men, and women, accepted its cold logic. Property must be verified. Legal transfers require sworn witnesses. Marriage produced legitimate heirs, therefore it demanded irrefutable proof. Women were merely the essential conduit through which family lines were secured. Within its own framework, the system was logical, even if it feels monstrous to us. The end of these harrowing practices did not come because Rome suddenly developed a conscience. It came from the outside, specifically from the slow, persistent rise of Christianity and the transformation of Roman values in the 4th and 5th centuries. With the new theology came radical new assumptions. If women possessed souls equal to men, they could no longer be treated as mere property. If marriage was a sacred sacrament before God, it could not include rituals the church deemed obscene. If modesty became a core virtue, the presence of witnesses during consummation became intolerable. The shift was gradual, messy, and never complete. But across elite households and cities, the ancient formal ceremonies were either abandoned or utterly reshaped. And with their passing, the evidence was systematically erased. Statues of Mutinus Tutinus were smashed or buried. Texts mentioning the wedding night rites were quietly removed from libraries or allowed to decay. Wall paintings hinting at the rites were plastered over. The Pranuba's duty shrank from an active, intrusive supervisor to a symbolic, distant attendant. Within only a few generations, the full, disturbing knowledge of what Roman weddings once required vanished, surviving only dimly in obscure religious and legal manuscripts read by specialized scholars centuries later. The Christians who rebuilt Rome were not just sanitizing an embarrassing past. They were intentionally forging a new civilization atop the ruins of the old, consciously refusing to acknowledge what those ruins had previously supported. They were almost entirely successful. Today, most people still envision Roman marriage as a charming blend of ritual and light romance, scattered walnuts and festive veils. But the fragments survive. Fragments always survive. Livia Tirsa died in approximately 31 CE, having been a wife for over 4 decades. She had raised children and fulfilled every expectation placed upon her. But what dominated her memory when she reflected on her wedding night? Did she relive the shame, the terror, the cold powerlessness? Did she eventually make peace with it? Or did she simply accept it as the unchangeable, brutal reality of her world? We can never know her true thoughts. She left no written record. Roman women of her stature were not expected to. The collective silence surrounding these rituals originates from women whose experiences were never deemed important enough to preserve, whose bodies were absolutely central to the legal system, yet whose thoughts were irrelevant to the histories men chose to write. We know what was done to them. We rarely know how they felt. Yet, we know enough to understand why generations tried so desperately to erase this aspect of Roman life. Rome is often romanticized as the infallible foundation of Western law, order, and civilization. But acknowledging what Rome demanded of its women dramatically complicates that narrative. It reveals that savage brutality and high refinement can coexist, that legal sophistication can operate seamlessly alongside systematic dehumanization. The rituals are gone, but the women who endured them were undeniably real. For Livia, for her mother, for her daughters, and for countless unnamed brides whose wedding nights were a ritual of control, scrutiny, and verification. They lived, they endured, and they were silenced. If Livia's story gripped you, consider subscribing to our channel for more historical deep dives. And before you go, tell us. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from, and what was the most shocking detail about the Roman wedding night.